The first time Clara Bennett stepped into Walter Hayes's house, it smelled like dust and old wood, and a grief that had been sitting too long in the dark. His wife had been dead for 3 years. But everything inside that house still looked like she might come back. Her cardigan still hung on the chair by the fireplace. Her reading glasses still sat folded on the kitchen windowsill, and on the table beside Walter's untouched dinner plate was a second placemat that no one had moved. Clara had only come to bring him soup. That was all. A pot of chicken soup because the storm had knocked the power out across half the county, and because she had seen his porch light stay dark for 2 nights straight, and because something in her could not stand the thought of that old ranch house holding only silence. Walter opened the door in his flannel shirt, his grey hair damp from rain, his shoulders broad, even with age, his eyes tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He looked at the soup in her hands, then at her. Then back at the soup like he had forgotten what it felt like for someone to show up carrying warmth. You didn't have to do this. She should have handed him the pot and gone home. Instead, she followed him inside. And 20 minutes later, while thunder shook the windows and the two of them sat at his kitchen table, eating in the yellow glow of a lantern, Walter looked around that empty house, tightened his hand around the spoon, and whispered the words that changed everything. You make this house feel alive again. She should have left after that. She did not. And by the time Clara understood that loving Walter Hayes might cost him his son, she was already too deep to walk away. If you have ever loved someone who was still learning how to let themselves be loved back, this story is for you. Welcome to Aurora Cinema Fiction. Stay with us. If this story moves you, please subscribe, like, and share. It means everything to this channel. Clara Bennett had not planned to return to Ash Creek. She had planned to stay in the city, where she had built a life with a man named Richard, who had turned out to be building a different life entirely, with someone she had considered a friend. The divorce had been final for 7 months. The farmhouse her grandmother had left her had been sitting empty for 2 years, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. Clara had driven there on a Tuesday in February, with 3 boxes and a cast-iron pot, and the particular determination of a person who has run out of reasons to stay somewhere and needs to find a reason to start again. What she wanted was simple, a home that felt safe again, to stop feeling like too much, to be somewhere that her particular brand of caring was not a burden but simply herself. Ash Creek was the kind of town that noticed when someone new arrived and remembered when someone came back. The woman at the feed store said welcome home, like she had simply been away at school. The pastor waved from across the street. Mrs. Garfield from the post office squeezed her hand in a way that held no pity and considerable warmth. And everyone she spoke to in those first few days mentioned Walter Hayes. Not intrusively. Just the way small towns mention the people who have become part of the landscape of collective concern. The widowed rancher next door. Lost his wife Margaret 3 years ago. Has not been the same since. Clara had seen him from a distance those first days. A big, quiet man, moving slowly between the barn and the house, with the unhurried economy of someone who has reduced his life to its essential tasks, and is doing them mostly out of habit. She recognized something in the way he moved, and was not ready to stand next to it. The particular posture of a person who has accepted that life has become smaller than it was supposed to be. She had spent 7 months wearing that posture herself. The storm came on a Thursday evening, heavy and fast the way storms come in hill country, moving across the ridge and dropping the temperature 15 degrees before the first crack of lightning. Clara's power went out at 6. She lit candles, warmed soup on her grandmother's old gas stove, and listened to the rain hammer the tin roof. At 8, she noticed Walter's house was completely dark. Not dark the way a house is dark when someone has gone to bed. Dark the way a house is dark when no one inside it has thought to light anything. She stood at her kitchen window for a long moment. Then she put her coat on and picked up the pot. The walk between the 2 houses was 50 yards of mud and rain. She knocked. She heard nothing for a long time. Then the door opened. Walter Hayes was taller than she had realized from a distance. He filled the doorframe the way men do when years of physical work have built them into something solid, and unhurried. He looked at her, at the rain running off her coat, at the pot in her hands. "I'm Clara Bennett. I'm staying in the Whitfield place next door. I noticed your lights were out and I made too much soup." It was not entirely true. She had made exactly enough soup, but she had learned that people received things more easily when you gave them a reason that required nothing of them. Walter looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped back. She went inside. The kitchen was clean but cold. A single candle on the counter, throwing just enough light to see by. She set the pot on the stove and found 2 bowls without being asked, because they were in the first cabinet she opened, and because some things in old ranch kitchens are always in the same place. Walter sat down at the table. She set a bowl in front of him and sat across from him. They ate. Outside, the storm moved across the valley, shaking the windows and filling the silence between them with something that did not require filling. It was the most comfortable silence Clara had sat in for a very long time. She looked around the kitchen, at the cardigan on the chair, at the reading glasses on the windowsill, at the second placemat. She said nothing about any of it. She simply sat with him while the storm went on, and the soup went down, and the candle threw warm light across a table that had been set for one person for 3 years. When the bowl was empty, Walter set his spoon down. He looked around the room, the way a man looks at something he has stopped seeing, because seeing it has been too expensive. Then he looked at Clara, and he said it, quietly, the way people say the truest things. "You make this house feel alive again." Clara looked at him. She did not answer, because some things do not need an answer. She stayed until the storm passed. Then she walked home in the dark. She told herself she would not go back the next day. She went back the next day. Not with soup, with bread she had baked that morning, because the yeast was going to turn, and it was practical. Walter opened the door before she knocked. He had been watching for her. Neither of them mentioned that. She left the bread and stayed for coffee. The day after that, she noticed the vegetable patch on the south side of the house had gone to ruin. She asked if he minded if she cleared it. He said she did not have to do that. She said she knew. She cleared it anyway. He brought her water while she worked. Then he picked up a tool and worked beside her without discussing it. They fell into a rhythm the way people fall into rhythms when they are both quietly grateful for somewhere to put their energy. Clara brought bread, then preserves, then a pie made with peaches from her grandmother's old tree. Walter repaired the broken gate on her property without mentioning it. He left firewood on her porch before the next cold snap. One evening she was washing up in his kitchen when she mentioned Richard. Not intentionally. The way things slip out when the careful management of what you say starts to loosen. She said something about how she had always done too much for people. That Richard had told her once she smothered people. That her caring was too heavy. That not everyone wanted to be looked after the way she looked after things. She said it lightly, the way people say things they have been told so many times they have stopped questioning whether they are true. Walter looked at the bread on his counter, at the vegetable patch visible through the window, at the bowl he had eaten from. Then he looked at her. That man did not deserve a single bowl of your soup. Clara looked at the dish in her hands. She did not say anything, but something in her that had been held at a particular angle for 7 months shifted. The way things shift when someone says the true thing about you, and you did not know you were waiting to hear it. She finished the washing up. She went home. She stood in her grandmother's kitchen for a long time. Then she started a new batch of bread. Clara noticed the light one night around 11. She had been reading at her kitchen table and happened to look up and saw the living room light still on at Walter's house. She did not think about it. But the next morning when she came by with bread, the bedroom door was open, and she could see that the bed was untouched. Made neatly. Unslept in. She looked at it for a moment, then at the chair by the fireplace. Margaret's cardigan draped over the back, the impression of someone's shape still visible in the cushion. She understood. She said nothing. Made coffee. Left the bread. Went home and thought about it all day. That evening she went back at dusk. Walter was outside checking the fence line. She went inside. She stood in front of the fireplace and looked at the cardigan for a long time. Then she lifted it carefully from the back of the chair and carried it to the hook beside the back door, where coats went, where Margaret would have hung it when she came in from the cold. Not removed. Just moved to a place that made a different kind of sense. She sat down at the kitchen table and waited. Walter came in, 20 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the chair. Then, at the hook by the back door. He stood very still. Then he walked to the chair and sat down in it. Not on the edge. Not sideways the way a person sits when they are keeping a vigil. In it. The way you sit in a chair that is simply a chair. Clara looked at her coffee cup. Walter looked at the fireplace. Neither of them spoke. But something had changed in the room. Something quiet and significant that neither of them needed to name. One evening, not long after they sat on Walter's porch and watched the sun drop behind the ridge. He had his coffee, she had her tea. The ranch spread out below them, gold and quiet in the last light. Margaret planted those poplars. It was the first time he had said her name to Clara. She said they'd be tall enough to matter by the time we were old. He looked at the trees. They were tall. They are, Clara said. He did not say anything else. But something in him had shifted. The way a door shifts when it has been closed too long, and someone finally opens it, just enough to let the air through. Walter began to talk about Margaret, the way people talk about someone, when they have stopped protecting the grief and started trusting it to someone else. Not all at once. In pieces. The way she had taken her coffee. The way she had laughed too loud at her own jokes and not cared at all. The way the cancer had come quietly the first time and loudly the second, and how the second time he had sat beside her bed for 4 months watching the woman he had built his entire life around become smaller than the life deserved. Clara listened. She did not try to fix anything. She did not say she understood when she did not. She simply received what he gave her and held it carefully. One evening he said the words that changed the shape of what they were. "I don't know what this is, Clara. I just know the quiet doesn't hurt as much when you're here." She looked at the poplars Margaret had planted. At Walter Hayes with his worn hands and his wedding ring still on his finger. She understood then that she was in trouble. Not the bad kind. The kind that arrives quietly and changes the shape of everything without asking permission. Keep watching. The best part is coming. Ethan Hayes arrived on a Friday morning, tall like his father, but sharper around the edges. He walked into his father's kitchen with the expression of a man who has decided something before arriving and is looking for confirmation. Clara was at the counter making coffee. Ethan looked at her. Then at the kitchen, at the fresh bread on the counter, at the pot on the stove, at the 2 cups already set out. His jaw tightened. Walter said her name in introduction. Clara said good morning. Ethan said very little for the rest of breakfast. She excused herself and went home. She was pulling weeds from the vegetable patch that afternoon, when she heard footsteps behind her. Ethan was standing at the edge of the garden. He looked at the restored orchard visible beyond the fence line, then at her. "My mother died in that house. Do you have any idea what it feels like to walk in and find another woman standing where she used to stand?" Clara straightened. She met his gaze. She did not defend herself. She simply looked at him, the way you look at someone whose pain has found a direction it was never supposed to find. You may think you're helping him heal. To me it looks like you're teaching him how to live without her. His voice was not unkind. That was almost the worst part. It was the voice of a man who genuinely believed what he was saying. The ranch is not yours to fix. My mother's orchard is not yours to restore. He walked back the way he came. Clara stood in the garden for a long time. Walter came to her fence that evening. He looked tired. Not the old tired. A new one. Ethan has some concerns. I know, Clara said. He spoke to me. Walter's jaw tightened. He had no right. He loved his mother. That's not a small thing. Go be with your son. Walter looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded and went back to the house. Clara stood at her fence in the cooling evening and told herself she was doing the right thing. She almost believed it. She stopped coming by, not dramatically, but deliberately. She returned Walter's extra dish by leaving it on his porch before he was awake. She stopped sitting on the side of her property that faced his kitchen window. She told Mrs. Garfield she might not stay in Ash Creek as long as she had planned. She did all of it quietly so it would not look like leaving. But it was leaving, and she knew it. 3 days passed. On the 4th evening, there was a knock at her door. Walter was standing on her porch in the rain, holding the casserole dish she had left at his house 3 weeks ago, soaked through. He had walked across the field in the dark to return a dish he could have returned any morning for 3 weeks. "I washed it," she almost smiled. "I can see that." He held the dish. The look of a man who has rehearsed something and has decided in the last moment to say something entirely different. "I can handle this town talking. I can handle Ethan being angry. What I can't seem to handle." He stopped. He looked at her. "What I can't seem to handle is this house without you in it anymore." Clara stood in the doorway with rain coming off the porch roof and Walter Hayes in front of her, holding a casserole dish in the dark. She took the dish from him. "Come inside. You're soaked." He came inside. She made tea. Neither of them said anything important for a long time. They did not need to. Some things are said once, and then simply exist in the room. Clara discovered the debt by accident. Walter had left a folder on the kitchen table, and she had moved it without looking inside, and a paper had slipped out, and she had seen enough before she could look away. Medical bills from Margaret's treatment. 3 years of them. Numbers that made her throat tighten. And a letter from the bank about the eastern pasture. She put the paper back. She said nothing to Walter. But she spent 2 evenings in her grandmother's kitchen thinking. Walter had carried Margaret's illness quietly. The cost of it quietly. Everything quietly for 3 years, because that was what men like Walter Hayes did. They carried things until the carrying was all there was left. She called Mrs. Garfield, the pastor, the woman who ran the diner, and the man who owned the hardware store, and 3 families she had known since childhood. She did not tell them about the debt. She told them Walter Hayes had not had a proper supper with people around him in 3 years, and that she was fixing that on Saturday. Ash Creek showed up. All of it. Trucks in the drive, and casseroles on the counter, and children in the yard, and the hardware store owner bringing fencing supplies he said he had extra of and did not need back. Walter stood in the doorway of his kitchen and watched his house fill with people and food and noise and warmth. Clara was at the stove, flour on her cheek, laughing at something the pastor's wife had said. Walter watched her move through his kitchen, not the same as Margaret. Nothing would ever be the same, but warm and present and alive in a way that the house had forgotten it was allowed to be. He understood in that moment with complete and quiet certainty. He was in love with Clara Bennett, not because she had replaced anyone, because she had taught him that grief did not have to be the end of love, only the middle of it. Ethan had come back for the supper. Someone had told him about it. He stood at the edge of the yard watching with the expression of a man who has arrived at a funeral and found a party in progress. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the kitchen had grown warm and easy, Walter looked around the table, at the people in his house, and said something quiet and unguarded. "For the first time since Margaret died, this place feels like home again." The table went soft with warmth. Clara looked at her plate. Ethan went very still. And then Walter added the thing that cracked Ethan open completely. Margaret would have loved what Clara did with the orchard. Nobody moved. The yard went quiet. Ethan stood up. He said things that should not be said at a supper table. He said things that should not be said in front of people. He looked at Clara and said the thing that cut the deepest. "You brought 1 pot of soup and turned my father against his own family." Walter said his son's name. Clara set down her fork. She did not argue. She did not cry. She stood up, said good night, and walked across the field to her grandmother's farmhouse in the dark. She started packing the next morning. By noon, she had filled 3 boxes and still could not bring herself to touch the soup pot on the counter. Not out of anger, out of the clear, cold understanding that she would not be the reason a father lost his son. She had come to Ash Creek to rebuild something, not to break something that already existed. Walter found Ethan in the barn. He did not go in anger. He had sat with it for a full night and let it become something cleaner before he said a word. He told his son the truth, not in pieces, all of it. How the house had felt after Margaret died. Not sad, empty in a way that was different from sadness, the kind of empty that has no bottom. How he had been sleeping in the chair by the fireplace because he could not make himself sleep in the bed they had shared for 31 years. How Clara had moved Margaret's cardigan to the hook by the back door without a word, and that small thing had given him permission to sit in his own chair again. How the quiet had started to hurt less. How he had started eating properly again. How he had started looking at the poplars Margaret planted and feeling something other than the absence of her. I loved your mother with the first half of my life. Ethan was looking at the barn floor. She was everything. You know she was everything. Ethan's jaw was tight. But she would hate what this house has become without Clara in it. She would hate seeing me like this. You knew her. You know that. Something moved across Ethan's face. The first real fracture, because Ethan had known Margaret Hayes, her laugh and her stubbornness, and the way she had always said that the worst thing a person could do was let fear make their decisions for them. He had known her. And he knew his father was right. He looked at the barn wall for a long time. Then he said something that cost him. She used to worry about you being alone, in the last months when she knew. His voice was not quite steady. She used to say she didn't know how you'd manage, that you'd never learned how to let people in. Walter was quiet. She'd want you to let someone in, Dad. The barn was very still. Walter put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder. Then he went to his truck. He drove to the Whitfield farmhouse. Clara's truck was in the drive. 3 boxes visible through the window. He knocked. She opened the door. She had been crying. Not dramatically. The quiet kind that happens when you have made a decision you believe is right, and it costs you anyway. He held out the soup pot. The original one. The one from the storm. I washed this months ago, never gave it back. Clara looked at the pot, then at him. I kept it, because it was the first sign of life in that kitchen after Margaret died. Every time you knocked, I felt something come back that I thought was gone. His voice was steady. The way things are steady when a person has decided to say the true thing, regardless of what it costs them. I thought loving Margaret meant spending the rest of my life standing still where she left me. Then you walked into that kitchen with a pot of soup and reminded me that loving her was never supposed to mean I stopped living. He looked at her directly. I loved Margaret, with everything I had, and I will carry her for the rest of my life. But you are the woman I want, in the second half of it. He held out the pot. You didn't take her place, Clara. You brought me back to mine. She stood in the doorway with 3 boxes packed in the front room, and Walter Hayes in front of her in the afternoon light. She took the pot. She stepped back. Come inside. I'll make soup. He came inside. Months later, the ranch was alive in ways it had not been in years. The vegetable patch had produced more than 2 people could eat, and they had given most of it away. The orchard on the north side was flowering again. The kitchen smelled like bread and coffee, and the particular warmth of a house that has remembered how to be inhabited. Walter had not taken his wedding ring off. Clara had not asked him to. Some things are not replacements. They are additions, continuations, the second half of something that the first half made possible. Ethan came for Christmas. He was quieter than he had been. He helped Walter with the fence in the morning and sat at Clara's kitchen table in the afternoon and ate 2 bowls of soup without being asked. At the door he hesitated. Then he looked at Clara and said, Mum would have liked that you kept Dad eating real food. It was awkward and imperfect, and more apology than Ethan had ever known how to give. One evening in January, Walter and Clara sat on the porch in the cold. with blankets around their shoulders, and the valley spread out below them, silver and still. The poplars Margaret had planted stood dark against the sky. Tall enough to matter, Walter reached over and took Clara's hand. They sat like that for a long time. The kitchen window behind them glowed warm with light. Then Walter said quietly, "Told you." Clara looked at him. "You made this house alive again." She looked at the poplars, at the warm window, at the ranch that had come back to itself, the way places come back when the people inside them decide to stay. "I think," she said, "it made me alive again too." Walter held her hand. The valley was quiet. The light stayed on. "Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe to Aurora Cinema Fiction. Leave a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. You might be surprised how many people felt exactly what you just felt. And remember, every story we tell is made with one purpose: to make you feel deeply and remind you that love in all its forms is always worth fighting for.